as this is going to be a study in history, church history one way or another, I did want to make sure that we spent at least some time in the Word introducing that. So if you have your Bible, turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to take a long time on this. I'm going to read a number of verses here. And these verses, again, in many ways, I won't try to do it as I'm reading, as I'm going through it, and commenting, parallel a lot of what we're going to be talking about in terms of evangelicalism. This is actually a text in which Paul is recounting the experience of the nation of Israel at the time of Moses. And again, you'll see the parallels, I believe. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, beginning at verse 1. Paul writes, "For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea." By the way, our expression under the cloud can be negative, but in this case, under the cloud is under the cloud of God's leading, the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. "And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ." There's so much that, again, we could say there, but again, that they were blessed with all the spiritual blessings, as well as the physical blessings that they were provided with, and it was all hope. It was all expectation at that time, right? I mean, the nation was looking forward to. They'd just come out of bondage, and this was the start of something new that they were really looking forward to. God's promises were about to be fulfilled with them. Verse 5, "Nevertheless, with most of them God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness." Now Paul applies this. "Now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. Do not be idolaters as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and stood up to play. Nor let us act immorally as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. Nor let us try the Lord as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents. Nor grumble as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come." And I think that's sort of to anticipate what we're going to be learning today. That's kind of what I'm anticipating as a principle. Not to say that these are just of historical interest, but to study this subject of evangelicalism together as an example, as something of a paradigm that we can follow and look where deviations were made and things that we need to avoid, or things that were positive examples that we can follow to stay true. And then a very famous admonition that I think everybody learned in Awana. "Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed that he does not fall." And again, it's not a matter of looking at the past here and saying, and just clicking our tongues at these people and going, how did they do that? But to look at that and say, we need to be careful, because we too have a responsibility and a legacy that we need to keep up for future generations. It's always the case that we read history with the idea that we are the end of history in mind. I remember reading, when I was in high school, the American history textbook said the patriots at Bunker Hill fought so that I could have freedom, and that the Civil War was fought so that I could live in a free country, and that we defeated the Nazi Germany so that I could live in a free country. And it pretty much sounded like everything had me and my generation in mind. And then when I read my son's high school textbook, it made it sound like everything was done for their benefit, which I assured them was wrong, because it was really done for us. So if you're from the baby boom generation, it's really all about us, and has been from the very beginning. So if you ever know what's going on in the country right now, it's that, it stopped being about us, and it should go back. No, I'm just kidding. But the point being is that, again, we should look at these things and not think we're the end of history. We're not the end of history. So we need to appreciate what's gone before. We need to learn the lessons from what's gone before, and then we need to prepare for what's to come. Well, I've used up a great deal of my time already just giving an introduction. So let's talk about evangelicalism. I've kind of used the metaphor of a tree here in the notes, but I do something your 5th grade English teacher told you never do, is mix metaphors, so I'm going to be doing that all the way through as well. Why study ecclesiastical history? Very quickly. Why should we do this? Well, I've already said it, because we need to look at their example, look at what they did wrong, and make sure we don't fall into the same problems. We need to study it because we need to understand the present confusion. And I think when you start talking about a subject like evangelicalism, it's more confusing now than it ever has been. And that could be a statement of our entire society. We need to decide if we like this term evangelicalism, and if we want to use it for ourselves, or even if we have a choice to use it for ourselves. Some people think today, if you follow cable news, evangelicalism is a political movement in some fashion or another. How did that ever happen? That evangelical is a voting bloc. Well, that's certainly not at the core of what we do. Another part thinks it's like an extension of Puritanism. And we'll mention briefly, again, Puritanism coming up. But you know what H.L. Mencken, the guy that covered the Scopes trial many years ago, what he said about Puritanism. He says a Puritan is somebody who's deathly afraid that somebody somewhere is having a good time. And some people apply that to evangelicals. We're just looking around thinking, anybody having fun here? We got to figure out how to stop that. But I think we need to get into understanding what evangelicalism is. The term evangelicalism obviously is not so straightforward, and it's sort of like paraphrasing the great theologian Inigo Montoya. Anybody know who Inigo Montoya was? If you've ever seen the movie The Princess Bride, he's the guy that he's got some very famous lines. One of his is, to paraphrase, we keep using that word, but I don't think it means what we think it means. So we keep trying to figure out what evangelicalism is, but we don't really know. What is it? When did it begin? Well, that's what I hope to help us to understand. So now what I'm going to say in the next few minutes is probably the most important thing to remember for the day as we go through these, because I'm going to be coming back to these points again and again. So it's always good to get this out, and this is the point at which, if you're taking notes, you just want to take some notes. It's easy to take these notes because it's going to be just 4 terms. One of the premier historians of evangelicalism, a fellow named David Bebbington, he's a Brit, wrote a book a number of years ago, Evangelicalism in Modern Britain, okay, so hold on, from the 1730s to the 1980s. So he's a historian. And what historians do is they just look at the history first, and then they draw some conclusions. And he looked at the history of people who called themselves evangelicals or who were called evangelicals and said, okay, they got the title, but what does that title mean? What are the distinctives of that title? And he identified 4 distinctives of evangelicalism, and here they are. They sound like big terms, but I think you probably can see what they are. First is conversionism, and again, I'll explain a little bit more what these are. Conversionism, then activism, then that's the one that probably needs more explanation. Then you're going to understand what this one is, biblicism. I think that kind of speaks for itself. And then the last one, too, is cruciacentrism. Crucia from the term for cross. So we could say that what we're talking here is about evangelicalism is identified by its emphasis on conversions, the belief that lives need to be transformed by the born-again experience. Again, most of you that I'm looking at here probably remember when Jimmy Carter was running for president and became president, and that's when the term being born again kind of became a thing. I mean, for us it was always a thing, but in the culture, being born again was something that identified, and people started identifying as born again Christians. And by the way, if in some of these I slip into a southern accent, it's only because, again, that's kind of where it comes from. Born again, that's where it comes from. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. Activism. Now, that's one that Bebbington, he uses that term because that's the term, this is the concept that's going to morph and change the most as we go through our study of evangelicalism, activism. It started out, activism was essentially missionary activism. In the early years, activism was not only do you need to emphasize this conversionism, that people's lives need to change, but that it has to be through some active sort of effort. So it's not just sort of a natural process that just happens. Our pastor at Grace Community Church said, there's a saying that goes around, it says, always preach the gospel, use words when necessary. And he said, that's about the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. So evangelicals would say, okay, yeah, your life has to conform, but you have to be active. You have to be out there. Now that term, as I say, be aware it's going to change. Thirdly, biblicism. Well, that speaks for itself. I have very high regard for the Bible and the doctrines and teaching of the Bible, as well as obedience to the Bible. So biblicism. And finally, again, cruciocentrism, a stress on the sacrifice of Christ on the cross as making possible the redemption of humanity and those that would be saved. Now, what brings all of those together is a more basic term, and one that I know that you've heard of, is the root meaning of evangelical. So evangelical comes from the Greek euangelion, and forgive me, that's probably the last time I'll refer to Greek words from the pulpit, but it's pretty clear. Actually, from the Latin as well, evangelium, comes from two parts. The first part, the euangelium, means good, and angelos, you can hear the word angel in there almost, but that root of that in the noun form is message. So an angel was a messenger, and an angelos is one that brings a message. So euangelion is good message, or we would say it's the message of good news, the good news. And you've probably heard that, obviously. So that's the gospel. All four of those are related to that basic idea of preaching the gospel. You preach the gospel in order to see conversions. That has to be done actively. The message derives from the Bible, and the central message of everything is the cross of Jesus Christ is the heart of all of that. Well, that's what he says is the heart of what evangelicalism is. Evangelicalism is surrounding those four, or defined by those four terms. Now, again, I'll be sort of dropping in on as I tell you the history, I'll be dropping back in on those terms as we go along. Well, where did this emphasis, where did the movement of this gospel emphasis come from? Where did it actually start? Well, you could say it starts in the Bible. Some people ask me, on this term we can sort of, be friends and agree to disagree, maybe, I don't know, but I'm a Calvinist. And so I'm asked by some of my friends, well, where do you get your Calvinism? Who was the first Calvinist? And I said, Paul, John 2, or something like that. It's debatable, I suppose. Did evangelicalism start in the New Testament? Well, we had conversions in the New Testament, did we not? We had Paul's conversion. We had the conversion of the Philippian jailer. We had a couple of other conversions. We had famous conversions through history. St. Augustine had a very famous conversion in the city of Milan. So conversionism is something that's been around for a while, but that's too far back. Well, how about the Reformation? Did evangelicalism start in the Reformation? Well, it's interestingly enough, if you go to Germany today, every Protestant church is really identified as evangelical. The distinction there isn't Protestant and Catholic. It's evangelical, or Lutheran, basically, and Catholic. But then that's still, it's still a little too broad, and their emphasis wasn't quite there. Two other movements, very quickly, that are sometimes identified with evangelicalism, and there really are the deeper roots of evangelicalism, a movement called Pietism, Pietism, and Pietism was a movement that came up after the Reformation in the 17th century in Germany, as a reaction to the sort of cold orthodoxy that Lutheranism had sort of degenerated into. So Lutheranism got their doctrine right, but then it wasn't a religion of life. It was just going through the motions and everything. And so the pietists wanted to pump some real life devotion into it. And that word pietism obviously comes from the word piety, very, very sort of pious, devotional sort of idea. But not really, they didn't have the same sort of activism. They were in fact, the opposite. The pietists were sort of inward looking and sort of, just us together. Another movement that some suggest is one of the deeper roots of evangelicalism is, I've already mentioned, Puritanism. And the Puritanism was during the 16th and 17th centuries. And Puritanism that would be a whole course. Maybe that would be one we could come back and do as another time. That's huge, or huge if you're Trump, always with a Y on the front. But in any case, the idea of the Puritans was the Puritans really was a movement that was always responding to what was around them. So it wasn't a positive sort of thing. Surprisingly enough, it's like, well, let's see if this Reformation goes very far. Well, no, Henry VIII didn't do the right thing, so we're going to oppose him. And then even Elizabeth I, she didn't go as far as we needed to go, so we're going to oppose them. So the Puritans, also related to another movement called separatist, and that's where you have people like John Bunyan and Pilgrim's Progress and Thomas Watson, other famous Puritans, the Westminster Confession of Faith. All of that happened then. But again, that's still not deep enough or not complete enough, I should say, in order to say that's where evangelicalism started. That's not. One author said the four main principles identified by Bebbington don't exist in the same proportions and effects in all time and places. So we're looking for a time when all four of those things that I mentioned start, where they all come together. And there was really one time when that happened, and that was in the 18th century. So if you remember what Aaron said, that was my assignment. I'm supposed to pick it up about the 18th century and move on. So I want it well noted. I'm following instructions, and I'm doing exactly what I was assigned to do. So 18th century, and we have these revivals. Now, these revivals, I'm going to, as Aaron said too, I'm going to be sticking with talking about evangelicalism in America, but the story really is like a double story for evangelicalism in England at the same time, or the UK, I should say, and America. But I'm going to center kind of on America, maybe a couple of references back and forth. But the great revivals that we know of, and you've heard of this, I'm sure, as the Great Awakening, were really understood at the time as just an extension of the English revivals that were happening during the 18th century. That's when this gospelizing, that's when the notion of what we would call evangelizing, again from evangelical, really became sort of defined of a movement. And that movement, again, was a movement that emphasized, again, conversion. That was the principal one. It was centered on the Bible. It was something that was directed. Here's one of the things that we probably are familiar with. Again, this will be like later this afternoon, of evangelistic crusades as sort of a way to sort of try and win people to Christ. Which, by the way, these days, to talk about an evangelistic crusade is just about as politically incorrect as you can possibly, we're crusaders and things of that nature are not a good thing. But the point is that how did that start? Well, that started again in these revivals in 18th century England, these awakenings. And a couple of the features that were prominent in that, and this is what we'll get to, this is what I'm going to pause on and delve into a little bit more. These revivals were started by great preachers. And so I want to talk specifically about 2 or 3 individuals that are at the heart. We could actually say that these fellows are the creators of evangelicalism because of their emphasis on preaching for conversion and actively doing that in a setting that was sometimes in church, sometimes out of church, preaching from Bible doctrine and preaching particularly the cross of Christ. First one, more briefly than the others, would be John Wesley. And you have heard of his name. John Wesley, along with others, is the founder of the Methodists. And John Wesley was an Anglican priest, and he was his whole life. He never did leave the Anglican Church, even though the Methodist Church came out of that. It was really in the next century, in the 19th century, that a fellow named Francis Asbury in the States started what has come to be known as Methodism as a separate sort of denomination. Methodism, if you're from a Methodist background, you know they have the same hierarchical structure, the same sort of church polity, church government as the Anglican Church, but they came out from that. Again, a quintessentially American phenomena that then kind of went back to England a little bit later. But it was John Wesley and his preaching that sort of was one of the catalysts. Wesley did a lot of traveling on horseback and going around. And one story from Wesley is he would go in and he started just preaching for conversion. So he was one of the first that started this conversionism, where he would just go in and preach for conversion. It's so typical for us. Sometimes we've been to evangelistic crusades, as I said, or what in an older version, revival. We'll come back to talk about that. Or maybe you'll have just, okay, we're going to have a Sunday evening service, and the pastor's going to preach an evangelistic message. Be sure to bring your friends. We know that there are times when we sort of gear what we're doing on evangelism to seek conversions. That's very common for us today, but it wasn't until you get to this time. And people like John Wesley began to preach specifically for conversions. Now, think about this. He goes into an English, Anglican church, and he starts preaching for conversion, get this, as if not everybody there is genuinely converted. That's not going to sit well, okay? But he starts telling the people in the pew, you need to be converted. And they pull out their I am an Anglican card, okay, and say, what are you talking about, okay? He's talking about being genuinely converted. They weren't born again. They were church members, but not born again. So now you can start to see how the divide comes. And Wesley, in his journals, he would write, preached in such and such Anglican church, was told I will never preach there again. The next Sunday, preached in such and such a church, was told I will never preach there again. Until it finally got to the point where he just started preaching outside. Imagine, outside the church, preaching outside the church. This was a near scandal. And what did he preach? He preached what we would call the gospel. He preached for conversions, calling on people to be converted. A friend of his was a guy named, and he's the guy that is credited more with actually starting the revival. So Wesley started the way to do this, but his friend George Whitefield was the guy who actually then became the catalyst the Lord used for these revivals. And so starting in the 1820s, so you can see we're into the 19th century now, the 1820s, Whitefield was the guy that started preaching, and he didn't go to the churches. He just went out. He started preaching to anywhere he could preach. And by all accounts, it's sad we don't have any recordings of Whitefield. We have transcriptions that were probably edited later, but we don't really know that how spellbinding Whitefield really was. But everybody describes that his preaching was just really compelling. And he would preach to anybody, all different kinds of people that wouldn't be reached, would never come to the church or never even come to quote unquote revival or evangelistic crusade. He went to find them, and the story is told that he went to preach to Welsh miners, coal miners, and he was preaching to a crowd of Welsh coal miners. And as he was preaching, you could see the tracks of their tears cleaning away the soot from their coal mining as they were being converted, as they were being brought to faith in Christ. Whitefield then takes his evangelistic efforts to the colonies, over to America. And he starts in what were called the middle colonies, and he starts preaching in areas around Maryland, Pennsylvania, and those kind of things. And again, it started up again, where huge crowds of 10,000, 15,000, sometimes 20,000 people. Imagine this, without the benefit of projection, voice projection and things like that. And he would preach these, again, messages that would just be compelling. Story is told that even Benjamin Franklin, who was a lapsed Jew and a profound, professed atheist, used to love to come to hear Whitefield. Actually, gave him a big donation at the time because he just loved to hear him preach. It was just so compelling to hear him preach. Whitefield makes his way up to New England and starts preaching in the New England area, and comes into contact with the third name on the list is Jonathan Edwards. Now, Jonathan Edwards is the guy. I told you 1820s with Whitefield. That's wrong. Is the 1720s. But the Edwards had a revival at his church, quite unexpected, prior to the arrival of Whitefield in the 1740s. So yeah, go back, correct that on the tape. Will you go back to it says the 1740s. And Edwards had written a book entitled "The Surprising Work of God," about what had happened in his church. He was just preaching on the subject of justification by faith alone, very biblical sermons, and he wasn't doing what Whitefield was doing, and that is trying to get conversions, but he was getting them anyway. And there's this clearly a work of the Spirit, a revival at his church in Northampton, Massachusetts. And he wrote an account of it, and he sent it back to England. And Isaac Watts, the guy who wrote the hymns, picked it up and published it, and Edwards became quite well known, and the idea of getting a revival, so put it together when Whitefield, with his emphasis on preaching for conversions, seeking people to be converted, with what Edwards had experienced in terms of this surprising work of God, where you could actually have not just a few people, but hundreds, dozens and hundreds of people come to faith in Christ. That came together, and that's when what we call the Great Awakening happened. The Great Awakening takes place in New England, and then now that then becomes a sensation. Whitefield then heads back south again, and he goes south, and the Great Awakening follows all the way through. Again, the profound changes that happened to the churches. There were congregational churches in New England. There were Presbyterian churches in the middle colonies, and New Jersey and Delaware, places like that, as well as Pennsylvania. And then in the southern colonies, you had not as well organized religion. You had some Methodists and some independents, they would call them back then, even then. But that's the great revival, the great revival of the Great Awakening. And again, it was the preaching was characterized that accomplished this, and this becomes again a hallmark of evangelicalism. The preaching that accomplished this had a number of qualities, and I just want to run through those really quickly. The qualities that this preaching had, and again, this goes to the idea of biblicism. The first quality of these sermons is they were all Bible-based. They were based on texts of Scripture. Now, we would think of them as somewhat more topical than expository, as we might think today, but they were all sermons that would start with Bible truth and all backed up with Bible doctrine. And they were loaded. In fact, Whitefield was one of those guys that just could quote scriptures off the top of his head over and over again, and he would be bringing all of these scriptures together, Bible-based. There was a high level of emotional intensity that went along with this. Now that's where we would sort of wonder about this, but it was again this Edwardsian sort of surprising work of the Spirit emotionalism, not something, we're going to see this in a bit, something that was ginned up. It was something that was there. So very deeply biblical based, something that was highly emotional. And again, the third thing is they were very pointed, so that the kinds of illustrations that would be used, the kinds of applications that would be brought forth would be so pointed that people would say things like, "I thought he was talking directly to me." The applications would be for everyday life and things. This was, again, not very high scholarly Anglican type theoretical things, but very pointed, very much directed at people's lives. And that kind of preaching, again, produced conversions, many conversions. So again, it was this very active effort to try and get conversions. It was done through preaching the Bible, and the message, of course, was centered on the cross of Jesus Christ. Now, that last part would probably not be too different, and won't be too different in evangelicalism for a while. All right, so I've got about, 5 minutes, okay, before we, let me move in. I'm going to take a big chunk here, okay? And we're going to do this very, very quickly. After those revivals, what happened was evangelicalism already started to fragment. I mean, after those revivals, already we start to see the sort of the deviations. And when we start up next time, we're actually going to be picking it up there. What happens then in the 19th century after those revivals are over? And we'll see that, again, with those 4 terms, where evangelicalism goes in relation to those 4 terms. So, all right, so we want to... That's like a jet tour over the top of quite a number of things. And you can be happy that I didn't give you the dates of each one of those guys and, who was doing what and everything like that. So, but I hope you got it. So, questions? Did you do what Pastor Aaron said? Write things down? I know if you're out there, I've got the microphone, so if you have any questions. I am not that good, folks. You got questions. Okay, back here. Real loud. Yeah, that was just the tease for the next section. So very good. You got it. That's like on the news. They say, hey, we found a cure for COVID, but now, do you want to buy a car? I mean, no, we'll get there. So thanks. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. We will be, Repeat the question. With the rise of postmodernism and the intensity of that, when postmodernism, I'm putting Edwards now, skeptical, is skepticism, postmodernism. Are people willing to listen to those things? Well, again, coming up, we're going to see, another thing we're going to come up and see is that we're going to have something called the Enlightenment coming up here. It's really kind of happening at the same time. And this is slightly, I won't get into this in too much detail, but let me just, as a philosophy professor as well, postmodernism is nothing new. I mean, it sounds new, but it's not. It's just called skepticism. And what's happened is, from the time of, this is going way back, Plato and Aristotle, Plato said the real world is the ideal world. Aristotle said, no, the real world is the physical world. Okay? And how do we know about this world up here? It's rationalism. Everything's happening in our brains. Aristotle said, no, it's what we feel, hear, taste, touch, smell. And those two ways of knowing, rationalism and empiricism, have toggled back and forth since Plato and Aristotle. We know everything by just using our brains. We know everything by just, looking at the science or whatever. But neither of those work independently. And what happens is you keep trying to make one work as opposed to the other work, and it doesn't work, and you end up in skepticism. And the first round of skepticism was a guy named Epictetus, and he wrote a book that if you read it today, it was before Christ even, you read it today, you'd say, well, he's a postmodernist, because it's just skepticism again. And then somebody will say, no, let's try it again, and they would toggle back and forth between these two, and then you end up with skepticism. So when the postmodernists say we're doing something new, no, they're not. It's not postmodernism, it's just skepticism. And by the way, skepticism doesn't work either. When the postmodernist says, well, we don't know anything about truth, I say, is that true? It's easy to defeat a postmodernist. The good thing about postmodernism is the way that it undermines modernism. Because modernism says we know, and postmodernism says you don't know. Now, we know, we don't know, we know, we don't know. This is Sesame Street, okay? On this side we know, on this side we don't know. And then when I tell people I know, they say, how do you know? Not by the way they know. This is a freebie. I'll stop with this. This is apologetics. When somebody says, well, a postmodernist says, well, how do you know what truth is? So, well, John 17:17, thy word is truth. Listen, not thy word is true, but thy word is truth. See the difference? To say the Bible is true means it matches up with something called truth. To say it's truth means that's the thing you have to match up with. And then people will say, well, how do you know that the Bible is the truth? This is where I stop and I make eye contact with them. I say, God told me. God told me. So that's how I know.